Thanks for joining us on the Week in Review. I'm Paris Schutz. Mayor Brandon Johnson relives the ups and downs as he marks 1 year since his election. The mayor bullish on his accomplishments in tumultuous first year in office, according to an exclusive interview with Block Club Chicago.
If you can't see the need for reform here, you're just not looking.
Republicans whack Governor Pritzker after State Prisoner Review Board clears the release of convict Chrisetti Brand, who allegedly kills an 11-year-old boy 1 day later.
I challenge us today, and Alderman Taylor, to stop the political posturing.
25th Ward Alderman Byron Sigcho Lopez spared punishment after his protest speech in front of a burnt American flag. Some aldermen want to say over whether controversial ShotSpotter gunshot detection system should continue in their wards. Major layoffs at WBEZ and Chicago Sun-Times parent company Chicago Public Media. And in sports, the Cubs off to the races to start the season, while the White Sox limp to an early last place standing. Not pretty on the south side. And now to our Week in Review panel. Joining us are Heather Sharon of our own WTTW News, Dan Mihalopoulos from WBEZ, Jeremy Gorner from the Chicago Tribune, and Brandon Pope from WCIU. Let's get right into it. Brandon Pope, Mayor Johnson is asked by the interviewer, his thoughts on his first year since the election. He says, quote, "Name one thing I haven't done, one promise I haven't kept." There are a few, perhaps, that he hasn't kept so far.
Yeah, there are at least 5 or 6 things that he hasn't done yet. It's sure there's still some time left there, but he is very bullish, and with everything, defiant, even when it comes to his progressive agenda, and going full speed ahead on it, which is pretty par for the course for what he's been campaigning on. It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out going forward and see if some of these moves he's making can actually be successful for his tenure.
And he does say, Heather Sharon, he's fulfilled all his campaign promises. So he did fulfill a promise to get the Bring Chicago Home tax hike on the ballot, but voters did not approve it. Does that count as fulfilling that
I think
promise?
It does, because he said he would create a dedicated fund to address the unhoused in Chicago. That is very much a work in progress. I also think, though, that we're seeing a little bit, and forgive me the sports metaphor, that the best offense is a good defense, or the best defense is a good offense, because you might think after suffering this defeat, he might sort of take a little bit of a defensive crouch or try to moderate or sort of say, well, I'm going to take a new approach. We've seen none of that. You know, he literally said, I'm ready to punch back. And I think that he found during the campaign, because as he is very fond of reminding us all, he came from very far behind when nobody gave him a shot, and that he sort of feels like he was able to communicate his way to the mayor's office. And I see him sort of trying to sort of go back to that sort of, he's his own best spokesperson.
Use the bully pulpit to keep pushing those forward. Dan Mihalopoulos, what's his grade as he approaches year one?
You know, the grade that the voters would give him, I don't think is anywhere near as high if he really believes what he's saying. And I don't doubt that. He sounds like he's really bullish on himself. I don't think the general public is as happy. Many people may not, tune in to electoral politics, and his reelection hopes are that's a long way down the road on a lot of ways. But, I think he's got this joke that, he's got a lot more time, like 23 more years, implying that he's going to have 6 terms and break the record of Richard M. Daley and surpass Richard J. Daley as well by a lot. And I think that's really optimistic at this point. I thought it was a joke, but he keeps. I was told that he would stop making that joke.
That he wants to serve for 23 more years.
Maybe he wants to, and he should be proud that he got elected once and he is a mayor of Chicago. But I think he needs to slow his roll in terms of that overconfidence. I don't know that overconfidence or expressing it in that way will serve him in continuing to pursue his agenda.
Speaking of expressing things, Jeremy Gorner, in this interview and many interviews, he doesn't tend to go off his platitudes very much or answer the questions. Is that consistent with other mayors, or do you see as a reporter perhaps a higher level of deflecting some of these questions?
I think it is pretty consistent with other mayors, Paris. What I've really noticed too with Mayor Johnson is that, he doesn't really take questions at press conferences. I mean, every time they send the media advisory, it's going to be B-roll only. I mean, we saw where he's not going to take questions, especially on key issues where he was dodging questions about ShotSpotter, the migrant crisis, and other things. And it's unlike Mayor Lightfoot. When she was kind of in her honeymoon period prior to the pandemic, she was always available to the media, and she would, in answering questions before, crisis hit, obviously.
And that changed pretty quickly. I should say Mayor Daley was typically out most days of the week. Rahm Emanuel, usually once a week. That was the rule for him.
So Johnson actually took questions twice this week from the news media, which was a very big change. And they've started doing sort of pull-asides where he'll have an event and then he'll step to the side, he'll answer questions from reporters. And if we're seeing a shift in strategy, that I think is an indication of it. However,
so speaking of communicating and being his own best advocate, communicating his message, he needs to talk to reporters then.
Yeah, and this is a situation where in his role as Cook County Commissioner, there were not reporters beating down his door to ask him about the issue of the day or whatever the controversy was at the moment. So this, I think, has been a little bit of a learning curve for him. And I have certainly communicated to him and to his staff that the more you answer our questions, the less frustrated we are. And if we get more chances to ask questions, the less chance that
and no one doubts his
aggressive.
Skill in answering the way he wants to answer.
And the other thing I wanted to add to what Heather said was that, he's talking about still getting his message out there in the Block Club story regardless, but he's got to realize that we in the media, we're the conduit for that message. I mean, 90% of what he says is going to come through your TV cameras. It's going to come through our writing, radio reporting, etc. So that's something, to Heather's point, I think that he's finally starting to come around a little bit, at least from what we've seen the last few times.
And so many politicians, including mayors, don't like that fact. They're surprised somehow that the message they want out there isn't always the message that's out there. Mayor Lightfoot, you talked about that honeymoon period. That went away pretty quickly, and her opinion of local media soured pretty quickly. Brandon Johnson, you wanted to jump in here?
Well, yeah.
Brandon Paul.
It's a pretty hard name right now. I can understand the confusion. But I think one thing that he's got to do, and I think he is doing, because we've seen some changes in the communication staff, is get away from the talking points. Because how many times have we heard, I've raised kids on the west side of Chicago, I'm a school teacher. He's finally starting to not answer every single question with these campaign, talking point, and flowery things, and finally giving us a little more substance, even though he is still not getting to the heart of the answer when we need it.
Right. The frequency and the substance. First, the frequency. Heather, you're saying, well, twice in 1 week. Daley was more like 3 or 4 times a week. Yeah. His favorite answer was, gee, I don't know. But, be that as it may, and I don't think I sounded like him at all, because I'm North Side and he's South Side. But
very different.
But the reality is that in terms of the substance, I think what you're talking about, Brandon, not Brandon Johnson, is a situation where he sounds a lot like a school teacher and not like a politician, which did get him elected, but it's a tough job. You got to take some clear stands. When Daley was confronted, he'd say people want someone to lead. Is Brandon Johnson leading clearly and communicating how he intends to lead?
There's someone new that's going to lead his staff. The new chief of staff, Christina Pacione-Zayas, she was the deputy mayor. She's going to replace the departed Rich Gaidas. So what does this appointment mean about the direction of his administration?
Well, I think it's best read as an endorsement of her handling of the migrant crisis, because she has been out front. She's been the one answering the questions from the news media, and she's been the one sort of devising the strategy. So I think we can read that as Johnson saying she has done as best a job as anybody could under really trying circumstances. I think it's also an indication that we should not expect the mayor to be anything other than the most progressive mayor in Chicago history, because Christina Pacione-Zayas was sort of one of the leaders of the progressive movement on the Northwest Side that really sort of seized political power in that part of the city and sort of built a base that helped elevate Johnson into the mayor's office. So I think that is sort of saying, we're going to sort of focus on those people who sort of share our values, and we're going to work on sort of communicating them. Gaidas was always sort of a little bit of an odd fit for the Johnson administration. He started under Daley, he served under Emanuel, he served under Lightfoot. He was somebody who was known who was going to keep the trains on time, but he was in no sense a true believer of the progressive movement.
I think the word on the street was that he was going to stay around through the Democratic National Convention, and that obviously didn't happen.
Yeah, and one thing about being a guy who had been there in other administrations is that there were people in the rank and file in the police department and other parts of the city workforce that knew that, you know, this guy wasn't an ideologue, that this guy was a technocrat. And now you have someone in there, some people would say she botched the migrant. You know, that's something we could debate all day. She was also very big on that big piece of his progressive agenda, which some people would call the mansions tax that brings Chicago home. And that went ultimately down the tubes on election day. At this point, you know, we're going to give her a chance. I think she's the first Latina that's in that job as a chief of staff to any mayor. And, you know, we wish her luck because it's a tough job.
No doubt about it.
It's a hot seat.
And it's a doubling down on the progressive agenda, as Heather mentioned there, because getting rich in there seemed like a, you know, kind of a tip of the cap to the moderate side, the moderation, but she's had 11 months to learn underneath them. So we're going to see firsthand what she absorbed there and see if there's any way she can maybe bring some moderation here and work with, you know, developers, landlords on things like Bring Chicago Home and the homeless crisis.
And I was going to say, because you talk about the migrant crisis, you know, Christine Passion-Zayas was obviously in the Illinois Senate before all this, and she was very well respected in the Senate, very progressive, kind of like she was kind of part of a group of new progressives that joined the General Assembly the last 4 years. And, you know, there's obviously been, you know, debate, even among Democrats, about $182 million that Governor Pritzker is proposing for, you know, new money for migrants going into the next budget. And you have some Democrats who are really, you know, reluctant about, you know, about that a little bit, especially Democrats who represent traditionally poorer neighborhoods, you know, that have been underserved for many, many years. But maybe what it could do is, you know, she could kind of, you know, complement that a little bit and maybe, you know, work with the General Assembly a little bit, you know.
And speaking of the General Assembly, I got to ask you about Republicans this week. They're calling for changes to the Prisoner Review Board, as we mentioned. This is after 2 members resigned, after Crissetti Brand, his release was approved. The next day, allegedly he attempts to kill his ex-girlfriend, allegedly kills her 11-year-old son. So what are these changes that Republicans are proposing?
So among the changes, they're talking about, increasing, penalty enhancements really for orders of protection, making it a Class 4 felony from a misdemeanor, among other things. And that's going to be a very tall order in the General Assembly. Especially the last 5 years, as it's become more progressive, vehemently against penalty enhancements. That's going to be a tough sell. And then, you know, requiring X amount of years of experience for, you got to be a former police officer, former prosecutor, former defense attorney. I think there was like up to 20 years experience prior to the PRB. But, you know, a lot of the members on the PRB, there's like a former police chief on the board. Don Shelton himself, who resigned as, you know, as head of the PRB when he was on your show early this week, he was a Champaign police officer for many, many years before serving many, many years on the PRB. I will say this.
And he made clear that, you know, the decision they made, that was the decision that they pretty much had to make.
Yeah, and this is the thing, though, the political end of things with Senate Republicans. So take you back to 2022. They really beat the drum hard on Pritzker because of several of his appointments, were progressives who were put on they were releasing a lot of older inmates who were convicted of heinous crimes many, many years ago, some of them sickly, and releasing them through the board. Senate Republicans beat the drum about this, saying that this was not a good thing, and it's rare for any governor's appointment to be rejected in the General Assembly. The General Assembly rejected two PRB appointments put forth by Pritzker, largely because the Senate Republicans beat the drum so hard on this. They only have 19 members. They're in the super minority. There
aren't many issues that they can really get some traction on, so maybe they're thinking that this one is one. But is Pritzker showing his cards on what he wants to do in terms of replacing the members and the direction of the board?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very big issue for Pritzker. I think I'm going to pull rank here as the oldest one on the panel today. Old enough to remember when the only Greek-American presidential nominee in the history of major party nominee in 1988 in the history of the country got the tar beat out of him. You're looking at me. Willie Horton. Willie Horton was and Mike Dukakis being a governor got. Because
that was Roger Ailes that created that ad campaign.
Right, and recidivism is a huge thing, as we know. The prison system is also failing to affect prisoners. So I think Pritzker has to deal with this very, very carefully. This is the kind of thing that can be translated into a very clear narrative. When you look at the images of the 11-year-old kid who was killed defending his mom when the ex-boyfriend comes out and comes looking for her as soon as he's out, right? How many days was it?
Tragedy.
Horrible story that can very easily be understood by even people who don't pay attention to government.
And I want to add just one thing to what Dan said. Maybe 5-6 months ago, as a result of those changes from the PRB with members either leaving or getting rejected, Pritzker filled the board up with more members, and they started to release fewer people incarcerated, and older people in prison as a result. And I remember talking to a couple Senate Republicans in the fall. One of them said that he was very proud for the way that he feels the Senate Republicans turned around the PRB. Another Senate Republican told me, well, I think that they're becoming a little too strict, but they are doing as they should. And now, after this horrible, horrible tragedy happens, they're beating the drum all over again. And I think unlike 2022, I don't know, I want to say unlike 2022, I think it remains to be seen how successful they'll be if they beat that drum. Basically, like what Dan said, the ball's in Pritzker's court, because so far the Senate GOP has really been specific about solutions they want to put forth, but not so much the governor's office, at least yet.
It sounds like there is some common ground that can be reached here with Pritzker and those Senate GOP members when it comes to at least having some domestic violence training. This was a really horrible tragedy. Pritzker has talked about how this has really been politicized with the parole board in a way that hasn't been before. I think finding that bridge there, the domestic violence training, is probably something everyone could agree on here, because this just seemed like something that could have been avoidable.
Certainly politics enters the fray, though, in on all issues.
Unfortunately.
Heather Sherman, I want to take it back to some politics in the city government. 25th Ward Alderman Byron Sigcho Lopez, he easily survives a vote to strip him of his committee chairmanship after appearing at that rally, criticizing President Biden, criticizing the DNC, appearing behind a burned American flag. So what was the point of this whole exercise?
Well, it's interesting because I think it signals a willingness among moderates and conservatives on the city council to bring beefs to the floor of the city council in a way that we really hadn't seen before. There's no love lost between a whole bunch of alder people, but never before this year have we seen that sort of translate into efforts to sort of discipline or censure, progressive members of the caucus. What was interesting is that there was a real sense in that chamber on Monday that things had just gotten out of hand in a way that people didn't really understand. And I don't think it was, it was very on point for Alderman Maria Hadden. She stood up and said, guys, can we all just, disconnect our Twitter accounts, because so much of this outrage over the flag and what happened really sort of started on Twitter, and it was fueled by these accounts that sort of relish any misstep by the mayor and his allies, and it really sort of took off. And we also sort of saw shifting explanations. First, Alderman Sigcho Lopez was accused of burning the flag, and then it was not acceptable that he was near the charred remains of the flag, and then it was, well, he shouldn't have been at a protest that called Joe Biden Genocide Joe, and that called for protesters to get ready to be beaten by Chicago police outside the convention. And that really sort of shifted the narrative too.
Well, you heard Sigcho Lopez's words at the top of the show. He wants everyone to stop the grandstanding, stop the division. Couldn't he maybe turn the mirror on himself and say maybe he's doing some of that too with these Gaza speeches, while there's stuff happening in his ward, like the Pilsen migrant shelter, which he supposedly didn't know about the extent of the conditions, when we had reported on that.
I did find it interesting when all of this was being floated on X/Twitter by some older people, that they focused on the flag itself, which really, you can have debates about First Amendment there, when really...
Certainly it is First Amendment protected.
Certainly.
Yeah.
But really the issue, I thought, was the organization that he had aligned with here. If you look deeper into that organization, they put out some weird social media post about how the hottest fashion statement is for kids to go to protest for the DNC and have bruises on themselves. And I don't know. That to me as a politician, I don't know. Maybe you think a little deeper about where you show up, where you're pictured. That's what probably Byron Sigcho Lopez should be thinking about here. But overall, it did feel like a lot of grandstanding and really a heating point when we talk about divisions in the city council. It gets really nasty now, at a time where I've never seen it this nasty for city council.
Yeah, well, for less than a year, many of the Democratic Socialists on the city council had been in the minority and sort of made their political bones as activists and organizers. And now with the election of Mayor Johnson, they're committee chairs and they're in charge of stuff and they have actual real power at City Hall. And
Including
people,
Sitcho Lopez,
right,
who went from activist to housing
right.
committee chair,
So,
and that's what
you
they
know,
tried to strip
so
him
perhaps
of.
there's a little bit of sort of a learning curve again, that he can no longer be just somebody who speaks at all of these protests without sort of turning the white hot spotlight on him. And that, I think, is sort of what the larger progressive movement in Chicago has got to deal with.
And he mentioned the fact that, according to him, it was a veteran that had burned the flag. But, you know, maybe he doesn't realize how veterans might react to their alderperson appearing at an event like that.
Well, he also said that he didn't know that it had been burnt before he spoke. I think the reason that, and it was a veteran, I believe there was an interview with this veteran at our station and maybe elsewhere as well. Was it a veteran of Afghanistan, if I'm not mistaken, which obviously was a long and fruitless occupation and you know, presence in that military presence for us in that country that didn't end too long ago. But as far as Sitcho Lopez goes, you know, he was there complaining about Joe Biden and the treatment of immigrants. Sitcho Lopez himself is originally from South America. And then other people there were kind of more into the issue of Gaza and stopping the bombing of the Palestinians in Gaza by Israel that was started after the October 7th attacks in Israel. So there's a lot of different agendas. What it all boils down to, I think, is that you see something in the city council that you see in the party as a whole as we come into this presidential election year is far left pressuring a more centrist president, some more centrist or even you know, members of the city council that I would say are to the right of center, honestly, on issues like this. And, you know, there's a lot of division within the party that I think we're going to see in Chicago at the DNC in a big
protests,
way.
But you see at the national level, it seems like even President Biden shifting a little bit, and even Trump, you know, kind of shifting his message too, given what's been going on in that war and some of the things that Israel's carried out. I want to talk about ShotSpotter. Some older people are pushing a plan to keep the controversial detection system in certain wards. Can they do that?
No.
So, all right, let's move on.
So this is an order that will go to the city council. It's scheduled on April 17th. I would be very surprised if it gets a vote, since it only takes 2 older people to block a vote. This is essentially an opportunity for older people, mostly on the south and the west side, to voice their frustration with Johnson for ending ShotSpotter when their communities are really suffering under intense crime and violence. And, you know, on some level, it doesn't make any sense, right? If this is a tool that helps fight crime, why would you take that tool away? But Johnson's point is that it does not help, and it costs the city millions of dollars and diverts resources from sort of actual ways to fight crime. There's no mechanism for the city council to order the mayor to do anything, and there's no mechanism for the city council to say you must continue it in these wards. It is a lot of sound and fury.
It'd be tough to do it through wards.
Right, you can't, because the city
districts
is designed to be policed by police districts.
And actually, that's what I was going to say. Is David Moore, I believe, was the big proponent of this. I mean, David Moore is a politician. He's not a social scientist who's come up with data showing some of the shortcomings of ShotSpotter. He represents, you know, Auburn Gresham, and if you look at police statistics, year by year. Most of the shootings in Chicago, most of the murders, I mean, the 6th police district produces among the highest numbers in those crimes. And so I don't think that we should be a surprise that David Moore would want to bring that up as something he'd like to retain in his district. But yeah, like realistically, with rules in place, it's not going to go very far.
We should mention that the mayor, after a little bit of back and forth, has decided to end that contract after November.
Well, he promised he would do that as a candidate. It's been a difficult issue for him. And then he, at the last minute, we talked about it here on this show, extended it, and there was a lot of confusion in those days beyond the end of the Democratic convention, beyond the end of what is going to be presumably another hot and unfortunately violence-plagued summer in Chicago. And, you know, you've got some people on one side that really doubt the effectiveness. Inspector General Deborah Witzberg has come out with a report saying, you know, that it's not very effective. You had Kim Foxx saying that it leads to very few prosecutions. Other people even say that it's put people like Adam Toledo in danger when there wasn't that any of that sort of shots to be detected. And once you get through all of this, you still at the end of the day have a mayor who he might not lose in the city council. You're telling me he won't, but isn't it bad enough that he lost in a committee?
Oh,
I mean,
and that would
it's
never have happened
never
under
happened to-
Rahm Emanuel and Daley. So, if you ask Johnson about that, he'd say, look, I'm here to let everybody have their voice, have their say. And now David Moore can go to his constituents and say, look, I tried.
Right.
No, my hands were tied.
But I think the issue is maybe this should have happened before that decision to just all out announce you're going to cancel ShotSpotter and give that.
Because I think ShotSpotter still wanted to see if they could get another contract.
Right.
We're out of time, so our thanks to Heather Sharon, Dan Mihalopoulos, Jeremy Gorner, and Brandon Pope. And we're back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family, the Polk Brothers Foundation. Additional support is provided by tonight's presentation of Chicago Tonight, Week in Review, is made possible in part by Ann and Rich Carr, Francine and Dr. Anthony Brown, and the Mullenhour Progressive Philanthropic Fund in honor of Ida Mullenhour, supporting quality journalism.
And that's our show for this Friday night. Don't forget you can get Chicago Tonight and the Week in Review streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. And now for the Week in Review, I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful weekend. Jeremy Gorner, Monday, the eclipse. You spend a lot of time in Springfield. Are you going to go down south in the line of sight there?
I don't think we're going to go to Carbondale. Maybe southeastern Illinois. Maybe, Carbondale's like 3 hours from Springfield, so maybe somewhere
It's way down there.
Maybe an hour and a half. We'll see.
So you'll see mostly.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that is proud to recognize its 18 attorneys selected for the 2024 Super Lawyers List.